7-year-old Emma Morrison walked into the Iron Kings Motorcycle Club's 40th anniversary gathering, wearing a small denim vest with a patch that would change everything. But first, she would face their cruelest laughter. The little girl with blonde braids tied back in simple ribbons had no idea that stepping through those heavy oak doors would lead to public humiliation in front of dozens of hardened bikers who believed she had no right to be there. Derek Sullivan, the club's imposing sergeant-at-arms, would sneer at her simple clothes and mock her tiny vest, dismissing her as a lost child playing dress-up. He and his brothers would laugh until their sides hurt, never bothering to truly look at what she wore on her back. They had no idea who she really was. What happened next would silence the entire room and teach them a lesson about respect, legacy, and the danger of judging by appearances alone. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. Emma Morrison stood at the edge of the parking lot, her small hand gripping the worn strap of her backpack as the rumble of motorcycle engines filled the warm afternoon air. She was 7 years old, small for her age, with blonde hair braided into 2 neat plaits that hung down past her shoulders. Her grandmother had tied them that morning with simple blue ribbons, the same color as her eyes. Emma wore faded jeans with a small patch sewn over one knee, white sneakers that had seen better days, and a denim vest that seemed almost too big for her narrow shoulders. But it was the patch on the back of that vest that mattered, though no one had looked closely enough to see it yet. The Iron Kings Motorcycle Club's 40th anniversary gathering was in full swing, and the clubhouse before her looked like a fortress of leather and chrome. The building itself was an old converted warehouse with brick walls weathered by decades of sun and rain, its large windows reflecting the rows of gleaming motorcycles parked in precise lines outside. Men and women in black leather moved between the bikes, their vests heavy with patches and pins that told stories of rides taken and bonds forged on the open road. The sound was overwhelming, a symphony of revving engines, rough laughter, and classic rock music pouring from speakers mounted near the entrance. Emma took a deep breath, the kind her grandfather had taught her to take when she was nervous, filling her lungs slowly and letting the air out through her nose. She squared her small shoulders and began walking across the parking lot, her sneakers crunching on the gravel. She moved with purpose, her chin up, her eyes focused on the heavy oak doors ahead. Several bikers glanced her way as she passed, their conversations pausing as they registered the unexpected sight of a child walking alone through their gathering. Emma's heart hammered in her chest, but she kept her face calm and dignified, just as Grandpa Jack had always told her to do when facing something difficult. She was looking for someone important, someone who would understand why she was here, someone who would recognize what she carried on her back. She just had to get inside first. The inside of the Iron Kings clubhouse was a shrine to the Brotherhood of the Road. Dark wood paneling covered the walls, scarred and stained by 40 years of celebrations, arguments, and reconciliations. The air smelled of leather, motor oil, and the faint sweetness of spilled beer that had soaked into the floorboards over decades. Every inch of wall space was covered with framed photographs showing riders from every era of the club's history, their faces young and proud beside their motorcycles. Patches from other clubs hung in places of honor, symbols of alliances and respect earned through years of shared road time. A long bar stretched across the back wall, its surface polished smooth by countless elbows and beer bottles. The exclusive culture of the motorcycle club world was evident in every detail, in the way certain seats were reserved for officers, in the hierarchical arrangement of patches on members' vests, in the unspoken codes that governed who could speak when and who had earned the right to wear what symbols. This was not a place for outsiders, and everyone who belonged here knew it. Derek Sullivan stood near the center of the room like a monument to that exclusivity. At 6 feet 4 inches tall, with shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway, he commanded attention without saying a word. His arms were covered in elaborate tattoos that disappeared beneath the sleeves of his black t-shirt. Images of skulls, flames, and motorcycle engines rendered in stunning detail. His vest, what bikers called their colors, was worn leather decorated with patches that told the story of his 20 years with the Iron Kings. The sergeant-at-arms patch on his chest marked him as the club's enforcer, the man responsible for maintaining order and protecting the Brotherhood from threats both external and internal. His dark beard was trimmed close to his jaw, and his eyes, a cold gray, constantly scanned the room with the alertness of a man who took his duties seriously. Derek wore his role with pride, straightening his collar whenever he felt someone watching, his hand occasionally brushing the patches on his chest as if to remind himself and others of his authority. Around him, veteran bikers gathered in small groups, men and women with weathered faces and hands calloused from decades of gripping handlebars. These were riders who had crossed the country multiple times, who had survived accidents and storms, who had earned every patch on their vests through loyalty and sacrifice. Emma reached the heavy oak doors just as a younger biker was stepping outside, a bottle of beer in one hand and a cigarette in the other. Tommy Jenkins was 23 years old, new to the club by their standards, with only 2 years of membership under his belt. He had sandy brown hair pulled back in a short ponytail and kind eyes that widened in surprise when he nearly walked straight into the small girl standing at the threshold. He did a double take, his head jerking back as his brain tried to process what he was seeing. A child, alone, at the Iron King's clubhouse during their biggest gathering of the year. Tommy's first instinct was concern, and he quickly looked past Emma toward the parking lot, searching for anxious parents who might be chasing after a wandering daughter. Emma looked up at him with those clear blue eyes and spoke in a voice that was polite but firm. The voice of someone who had been taught proper manners and intended to use them. "Excuse me, I need to come inside." Tommy blinked, then crouched down slightly to bring himself closer to her eye level, trying to make himself less intimidating. His leather vest creaked as he moved, and he set his beer bottle down on the wooden railing beside the door. "Hey there, sweetheart," he said, his voice gentle and genuinely concerned. "Are you lost? This isn't really a place for kids right now. Is your mom or dad around here somewhere?" He glanced around again, more urgently this time, wondering if he should be helping reunite a lost child with frantic parents. Emma shook her head slowly, her braids swaying with the movement. "I'm not lost," she said with a calmness that seemed unusual for someone her age. "I know exactly where I am. I'm at the Iron King's clubhouse for the 40th anniversary gathering. I need to come inside because I'm supposed to be here." Tommy's confusion deepened, his eyebrows drawing together as he tried to make sense of her words. She spoke with such certainty, such conviction, that it gave him pause. He noticed her denim vest for the first time, saw that she was wearing what looked like an attempt at colors, though he couldn't see the back of her vest from his current angle. "Supposed to be here?" he repeated, his tone still kind but now uncertain. "I don't think. I mean, are you sure? Did someone invite you? Is there an adult you're meeting?" The sound of heavy boots on wooden floorboards cut through the music and conversation inside the clubhouse. Derek Sullivan had noticed the commotion at the door, noticed how Tommy had stopped mid-stride and was now crouching down talking to someone outside. Derek's instincts as sergeant-at-arms kicked in immediately, his gray eyes narrowing as he moved toward the entrance with the confident stride of a man who had never questioned his authority in this place. Other bikers moved aside automatically as he passed, recognizing the set of his shoulders and the purpose in his step. He reached the doorway in seconds, his imposing frame filling the space as he looked down to see what had captured Tommy's attention. His eyes landed on Emma, and for a moment his expression was simply dismissive, the look of a man who had just discovered something small and insignificant in his path. Then his lips curled into a sneer, and he let out a short, harsh laugh that had no warmth in it whatsoever. "What's this?" Derek said, his voice loud enough to carry back into the clubhouse, drawing the attention of nearby bikers. "Someone lose their kid? Tommy, what are you doing chatting with a little girl when we've got a party going on?" He crossed his arms over his broad chest, his biceps straining against his shirt sleeves, every inch of his posture radiating authority and condescension. Emma straightened her spine and looked up at the towering man before her, refusing to be intimidated by his size or his tone. "My name is Emma Morrison," she said clearly, her small voice carrying despite the noise around them. I have business with the Iron King's motorcycle club. I need to speak with the members inside. For a moment, Derek just stared at her, and then his laughter began in earnest. It started as a chuckle deep in his chest and grew into a full-bellied laugh that shook his shoulders. He turned his head to look back at the bikers who had gathered near the door to see what was happening, and his laughter became an invitation for them to join in the joke. "Business!" he repeated, the word dripping with mockery. "Did you hear that? This little thing has business with us." Several of the bikers behind him began to chuckle, feeding off Derek's energy. Derek leaned against the doorframe, making himself comfortable as if settling in to enjoy a good show. "Business?" he repeated, drawing out the word mockingly. "What kind of business could you possibly have here, sweetheart? You selling Girl Scout cookies? Because I gotta tell you, we're more of a beer and whiskey crowd." The laughter around him grew louder, and more bikers began to gather, drawn by the sound of Derek's voice and the promise of entertainment. They formed a loose circle around the doorway, some leaning against the walls, others crossing their arms as they watched the small girl standing before their sergeant at arms. Emma felt the weight of dozens of eyes on her. But she kept her chin up and her voice steady. "I have the right to be here," she said, trying to speak loud enough to be heard over the growing noise. "If you would just let me explain, I can show you why I belong." Derek cut her off with a wave of his massive hand, his gesture as dismissive as swatting away a fly. Hold on, he said, his voice dripping with false patience. "Did she just say she belongs here?" He looked around at the gathered bikers, making sure they were all paying attention to his performance. "How tall are you, kid? 3 feet? 4 feet?" He held his hand at different heights, each one comedically low. And the crowd laughed dutifully. "And how old? What? 5? 6? Emma's jaw tightened. "I'm 7 years old," she said quietly. "7?" Derek exclaimed, slapping his knee as if this was the funniest thing he had heard all year. "Well, that changes everything." "Oh wait, no it doesn't." More laughter rippled through the crowd. Derek straightened up to his full height, towering over Emma like a mountain over a pebble. "Let me explain something to you, little girl. This is a place for men and women who've earned their place on the road. We're talking about people who've ridden thousands of miles in rain, snow, and blazing heat. People who've broken down in the middle of nowhere and fixed their own bikes with nothing but a wrench and determination. People who've bled for this club." Emma's small hand gripped the strap of her backpack tighter, her knuckles turning white, but her face remained calm and dignified. More bikers joined in the laughter now, emboldened by Derek's performance and eager to be part of what seemed like harmless fun. Someone in the back called out, "Maybe she's got a tricycle parked out there," and the crowd roared with amusement. Derek's confidence grew with each laugh, his chest puffing out as he fed off the energy of his audience. He was in his element now, the center of attention, the enforcer putting someone in their place. He gestured dramatically at Emma's small denim vest, then grabbed the lapels of his own heavy leather cut, pulling it forward to display the weight and substance of it. "See this?" he said, his voice booming. "This is real leather. Been on my back for 15 years. Got caught in a rainstorm in Montana, survived a slide on gravel outside Tucson, soaked up sweat from riding through the Texas heat. That little thing you're wearing?" He pointed at Emma dismissively. "Did your mommy buy you that at a toy store? Is it from the kids section at the mall?" The crowd laughed even harder, some of them slapping their knees or nudging each other with their elbows. Derek was on a roll now, his performance growing bolder with each passing moment. "Tell me something, sweetheart," he continued, his tone mockingly sweet. "Do you even know what a motorcycle is? Can you tell me the difference between a Harley and a Honda? Do you know what it means to ride?" Emma took a deep breath, her voice steady despite the burning she felt behind her eyes. "I know what I'm wearing means," she said, her words clear and firm. "If you would just look at it, you would understand why I'm here." Derek threw his head back and laughed, the sound harsh and ugly in its dismissiveness. "I doubt that very much, little girl," he said, wagging his finger at her as if scolding a child who had told an obvious lie. I seriously doubt you have any idea what any of this means. This isn't dress-up. This isn't a game. This is a brotherhood, a sisterhood, a family built on loyalty and sacrifice. You can't just walk in here wearing some costume and expect us to take you seriously." The mockery became more pointed now, the laughter taking on an edge that went beyond simple amusement. A woman near the back of the crowd, her vest covered in patches from rides across the country, called out, "Can't stand wannabes who don't understand what this life means." Another voice chimed in, rough and disapproving. "Posers think they can just show up and belong." The word stung, but Emma stood her ground, her blue eyes moving from face to face as she tried to find someone who would listen, someone who would truly look at what she wore. Derek straightened his collar with deliberate slowness, his thick fingers adjusting the edges of his vest and making sure his sergeant-at-arms patch sat perfectly centered on his chest. He tapped it with 2 fingers, the gesture both proud and possessive. "You see this?" he said, his voice taking on a more serious tone, as if he were delivering an important lesson. "This took 20 years of loyalty to earn. 20 years of showing up for my brothers and sisters. 20 years of protecting this club, of living by its codes, of proving myself worthy of this position." He turned slightly, gesturing to the veterans standing nearby, men and women whose vests were heavy with patches earned through decades of dedication. "Frank over there has been riding for 43 years. That patch on his shoulder? He got that for organizing the charity ride that saved a kid's life back in 1995. Maria's patch? She earned it by riding through a blizzard to get help when 3 of our brothers broke down in the middle of nowhere. Every single patch in this room has a story, has meaning, has been earned through blood, sweat, and years on the road." Emma opened her mouth, her small voice trying to break through. "My patch has a story too. My grandfather." Derek talked right over her, his booming voice drowning out her words as easily as a thunderstorm drowns out a whisper. "We don't just hand these things out like participation trophies," he continued, not even glancing down at her. "You can't buy your way into this brotherhood. You can't fake it. You can't just show up one day wearing some patch you found online or bought at some flea market and expect us to respect it." Derek's expression shifted from amused mockery to something harder, something that carried real disapproval. His gray eyes went cold as he looked down at Emma, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost its playful edge. "You know what? I think you being here is actually disrespectful," he said, his words cutting through the laughter that had filled the space moments before. "You standing at our door, wearing that little vest, pretending you have any connection to what we do here, that's an insult to every person in this room who's actually earned their place." He shook his head slowly, as if disappointed by her very existence. "People like you don't understand what we've sacrificed. You don't understand the friendships we've lost to accidents on the road, the family members who don't speak to us because they don't approve of the life we've chosen, the jobs we've walked away from because they tried to make us give up our bikes. You don't understand any of it, and you showing up here like this, it's offensive." Derek moved then, his large hand coming down to rest on Emma's small shoulder. He wasn't rough with her, wasn't physically aggressive, but the gesture was utterly dismissive, the kind of touch you might use to guide a confused stranger back to where they belonged. "Come on, kid. Time to go find your parents," he said, beginning to turn her toward the door. The crowd of bikers parted automatically, creating a clear path from where Emma stood to the exit. It was a path of shame, lined with faces that ranged from amused to disapproving to uncomfortable. Some of the bikers wouldn't meet her eyes, suddenly finding the floor very interesting. Others watched with arms crossed, nodding in agreement with Derek's assessment. Emma felt her heart pounding so hard she thought everyone must be able to hear it. Her face burned with humiliation, but she refused to cry, refused to give them that satisfaction. Instead, she planted her feet firmly on the wooden floor, her sneakers squeaking slightly as she resisted Derek's gentle push. "Please," she said, her voice stronger now, louder, carrying the desperation of someone who knew this was her last chance to be heard. "Just look at my patch. That's all I'm asking. Just look at what I'm wearing on my back." Emma began to turn slowly, rotating her small body so that her back would face the crowd. so that the patch sewn onto her denim vest would finally be visible to everyone watching. But Derek was still making jokes, still playing to his audience, his attention focused on the reactions of the other bikers rather than on the child he was dismissing. "Oh, here we go," he said with exaggerated interest, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "The big reveal. I bet it's got a cute little butterfly on it, or maybe a unicorn." Several bikers chuckled, though a few of the older members had grown quieter, something in Emma's determination giving them pause. Emma's voice cut through the noise, clear and specific. "Jackson Morrison," she said, and the name hung in the air like a bell that had been struck. Several of the older bikers stopped talking immediately, their conversations dying mid-sentence. A man near the bar set down his beer with a soft thunk. A woman with gray streaks in her long black hair turned her head sharply toward the door, but Derek didn't notice the sudden shift in atmosphere, too caught up in his own performance to register the change in the room. He waved his hand dismissively, not even bothering to look at Emma's back. "Jackson Morrison. Wow, what a coincidence," he said, his voice laden with mockery. "You just happen to know one of our founding members?" "That's convenient." Emma's voice cracked slightly, the first sign of emotion breaking through her carefully maintained composure. "He was my grandfather," she said, and the words came out soft and vulnerable. The voice of a 7-year-old girl who missed someone terribly. "He left this patch for me. He told my grandmother to give it to me when I turned 7, and he said I should wear it here, to this gathering, so that his brothers and sisters would know." Derek cut her off with a sharp laugh, shaking his head, as if he'd heard the most ridiculous lie imaginable. "Sure he was," he said, his tone absolutely dripping with disbelief. "And I'm the president's best friend. Listen, kid, making up stories isn't going to get you anywhere. Jackson Morrison was a legend in this club, and using his name to try to weasel your way in here is actually worse than just showing up uninvited." The crowd near the bar shifted suddenly as someone pushed through with surprising force for a man of his age. Frank Cooper, known as Ironside to everyone in the club, was in his 70s. His face weathered by decades of sun and wind and road. He had been one of the 7 founding members of the Iron Kings back in 1985, and his vest was so covered in patches that you could barely see the leather beneath them. His gray hair was pulled back in a ponytail that reached halfway down his back, and his hands, gnarled with arthritis, had gripped more handlebars and turned more wrenches than most people could imagine. Frank had been standing near the back of the crowd, nursing a whiskey and listening to Derek's performance with growing discomfort. But when Emma had turned and he had caught a glimpse of what was on her back, his weathered face had gone absolutely pale, the blood draining from his features so quickly that the man standing next to him had asked if he was all right. Now Frank pushed through the circle of bikers with an urgency that made them step aside without question. His eyes locked on the small girl's back, on the patch that he had not seen in 3 years, the patch he thought he would never see again. "Derek," Frank said, and his voice cut through the noise like a knife through silk. "Stop talking." The authority in those 3 words was absolute, carrying the weight of 40 years of brotherhood and respect. Derek's head whipped around, his expression shifting from confident mockery to confusion in an instant. His swagger faltered visibly, his shoulders dropping slightly as he registered who had spoken and the tone in which those words had been delivered. "Frank, I'm just handling," Derek began, but Frank raised one trembling hand to cut him off. "I said, stop talking," Frank repeated, his voice quieter now, but no less commanding. He moved toward Emma slowly, each step deliberate, his hand trembling as he reached out toward her. "Child," he said, and his voice had gone soft, almost reverent. "Turn around again," slowly. "Let me see what you're wearing." Emma turned around completely, her small body rotating until her back faced the crowd fully. The patch sewn onto her denim vest was unlike anything most of the bikers in that room had ever seen in person. It was roughly 6 inches wide and 8 inches tall, embroidered with extraordinary detail and craftsmanship that spoke of custom work done by skilled hands. The central image was a phoenix rising from flames, its wings spread wide and its head thrown back in a cry of triumph. But woven through the flames were lightning bolts, 7 of them, each one rendered in silver thread that caught the light. Around the border of the patch ran text in Old English script that read, "Iron King's Founding Brotherhood," and below the phoenix, in smaller letters, "Courage, Loyalty, Sacrifice." The colors were rich and unfaded, the threadwork pristine despite the patch clearly being years old. Frank's hand went to his chest as if his heart had stopped beating properly. "Only 7, he whispered, his voice breaking on the words. "Only 7 patches like that were ever made in the history of this club, 1 for each founding member. Where did you get this?" Emma turned back to face him, and her blue eyes were bright with unshed tears now. But her voice remained steady and clear. "Grandpa Jack left it for me," she said. And the way she said, Grandpa Jack made it clear this was not a formal title, but a name spoken with deep love. He gave it to my grandmother before he died. He told her to keep it safe and to give it to me when I turned 7 years old. He said I should wear it to this gathering, the 40th anniversary, so that his brothers and sisters would know who I was and that he wanted me to be part of his family. The clubhouse fell into absolute silence, the kind of quiet that feels heavy and thick, as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. The music that had been playing in the background seemed to fade away, or perhaps someone had turned it off. No one spoke. No one moved. Every eye in the room was fixed on either Emma or Frank or the patch on the little girl's back. Derek's face began to drain of color, the confident smirk sliding off his features like water off glass. Frank turned slowly to address the room, his weathered face heavy with emotion and memory. "For those of you who weren't around in the beginning, let me tell you about Jackson Morrison," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the now silent clubhouse. "We called him Lightning because when he rode, it was like watching a storm move across the land. Fast, powerful, impossible to ignore. He was one of the 7 who founded the Iron Kings back in 1985, and he was the best of us in every way that mattered." Frank's hand trembled as he gestured to the patch on Emma's back. "Jackson died 3 years ago. Cancer took him, slow and mean. But he never complained, never asked for pity. He just kept living right up until he couldn't anymore." The old man's voice grew thick with emotion. "But the reason we made these patches, the reason only 7 exist in the entire world, goes back to 1989. We were riding back from a rally in Sturgis, about 15 of us in formation on the highway. A semi-truck jackknifed right in front of us. 3 bikes went down hard, trapped under the trailer. The fuel tanks ruptured, and fire started spreading fast." Frank paused, his eyes distant as he relived the memory. Jackson didn't hesitate. The rest of us were still processing what had happened, still frozen in shock. But Lightning was already off his bike and running toward those flames. He pulled 4 people out of that wreckage, 4 of our brothers and sisters who would have died if he hadn't acted. His hands were burned. His arms were burned. He breathed in so much smoke, the doctors said it was a miracle his lungs recovered. But he didn't stop until everyone was safe. The room remained absolutely silent, hanging on every word. We created these phoenix patches to honor Jackson and the other founding members, to represent what this club was supposed to be about. Rising from the ashes. Courage in the face of danger. The 7 lightning bolts for the 7 founders. These patches were never meant to be worn lightly. They were only given to those who truly embodied the values we built this brotherhood on. Courage, loyalty, and sacrifice. Emma's hands were shaking as she swung her backpack off her small shoulders and knelt down on the wooden floor to open it. The zipper sound seemed impossibly loud in the silent clubhouse. From inside, she pulled out a leather-bound journal, its cover worn soft with age and handling, and a manila envelope that had grown yellow at the edges. She stood back up, holding these items against her chest for a moment, as if gathering courage, then held them out toward Frank with both hands. Frank took them gently, his arthritic fingers careful with the precious items. He opened the envelope first, and photographs spilled out into his palm. The first one showed Jackson Morrison, younger and healthier than Frank remembered him in his final years, holding a tiny baby wrapped in a pink blanket. His smile was radiant. Pure joy, captured in a frozen moment. The next photo showed Jackson kneeling beside a toddler with blonde braids, both of them looking at a motorcycle engine he had apparently been teaching her about. There were more. Jackson pushing Emma on a swing, Jackson and Emma eating ice cream, Jackson with his arm around a small girl who was maybe 5 years old, both of them wearing matching bandanas. Frank's eyes filled with tears as he shuffled through the images, each one a window into a relationship he had not known existed. A granddaughter Jackson had loved, but kept separate from the club world to protect her. Then Frank opened the journal to the page marked with a ribbon, and he began to read aloud the final letter Jackson had written. To my brothers and sisters of the Iron Kings. If Emma is reading this to you, or if you're reading it after meeting her, then she has turned 7 years old and I am gone. I'm leaving her my Phoenix patch because she deserves it more than anyone I've ever known. True membership in our brotherhood has never been about age or size or how many miles you've logged. It's about heart. It's about courage. Emma showed more courage at 4 years old, when her parents died in that car accident, and she had to learn to live in a world without them, than most adults show in a lifetime. She embodies everything this club stands for: loyalty, sacrifice, and the strength to rise from ashes. Derek stood frozen near the door, his face now completely drained of color, every mocking word he had spoken echoing in the terrible silence. A door at the back of the clubhouse opened, and Marcus Thompson stepped out of his office with slow, deliberate steps. Bear, as everyone called him, was the club president. A man in his late 50s with a thick gray beard and shoulders that seemed to carry the weight of the entire brotherhood. He was shorter than Derek, but somehow more imposing, his presence filling the room in a way that had nothing to do with physical size and everything to do with earned respect. His expression was grave, his dark eyes moving from Emma to Derek and back again. I heard everything, Bear said, his voice low and controlled, but carrying easily through the silent clubhouse. I was in my office doing paperwork, and I heard every single word that was said out here. Derek's mouth opened and closed, his face going from pale to flushed as the implications sank in. The president had been listening. The president had heard him mock and humiliate a child. The president had heard him dismiss Jackson Morrison's granddaughter and use the founder's name as a punchline. Bear walked slowly toward Derek, his boots making soft sounds on the wooden floor. When he stood before his sergeant-at-arms, the disappointment on his face was palpable, radiating from him like heat from a fire. You just humiliated a legacy member's granddaughter, Bear said, each word precise and cutting. Jackson Morrison's granddaughter, one of the 7 founders of this club, a man who saved lives, who embodied everything we claim to stand for, and you laughed at his memory. You mocked his family. Derek tried to speak, his voice coming out rough and desperate. Bear, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know who she was. If I had just… Bear held up one hand, cutting him off. That's exactly the problem, Derek. You didn't know. You didn't bother to look. You didn't bother to listen. You saw a child and decided immediately that she had no right to be here, that she couldn't possibly belong. The president's voice grew colder. That little girl wearing Jackson's patch has more right to be in this clubhouse than you do right now. She's carrying the legacy of a founder, a hero, a man who gave everything for this brotherhood. What are you carrying besides your own arrogance? Derek's attempts to apologize fell flat, his words stumbling over themselves. Bear turned to address the entire room, his voice carrying the weight of judgment and authority that came with his position, effective immediately. Derek Sullivan is suspended from his duties as sergeant-at-arms, he announced, and a collective intake of breath rippled through the gathered bikers. This suspension will remain in effect until I'm satisfied that he understands what this club actually stands for and what it means to treat people with dignity and respect, regardless of their appearance. Derek's hand went instinctively to the patch on his chest, his fingers touching the symbol of his rank as if it might disappear at any moment. Bear continued, his tone leaving no room for argument. Derek will complete 100 hours of community service at the youth center downtown, working with kids who need mentorship and guidance. He will also spend time with Frank and the other founding members, learning the actual history of this club instead of the version he's apparently made up in his head, where we judge people by their size and age. The president's gaze swept across the crowd, landing on several bikers who had joined enthusiastically in the mockery. Anyone else who laughed at Emma, who made jokes at her expense, who contributed to her humiliation, should take a long, hard look in the mirror tonight and ask yourselves if you're living up to the values you claim to honor. Several bikers shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet Bear's eyes, their faces flushed with shame as they realized they had been just as wrong as Derek. A woman near the back wiped at her eyes, her earlier laughter now transformed into obvious regret. Then Bear's expression softened slightly as he looked toward the doorway, where Tommy still stood, his face troubled but his posture protective, having stayed close to Emma throughout the entire ordeal. "Tommy Jenkins," Bear said. And the young man straightened. "You showed kindness and concern when you could have joined in the cruelty. You tried to help when others chose to mock. That's the kind of character this club needs more of." Tommy nodded, his cheeks reddening with embarrassment at the praise but his shoulders squaring with pride. Finally, Bear turned to Emma, and his stern expression melted into something warmer, something that held both sadness for what she had endured and respect for how she had handled it. Emma's eyes were wet with tears now, the stress and emotion of the past minutes finally breaking through her carefully maintained composure. But when she spoke, her voice was steady and clear, carrying a dignity that seemed impossible for someone so young. "My grandfather taught me that mistakes are opportunities to learn," she said, looking directly at Derek, who stood frozen and shamefaced several feet away. "He said that the measure of a person isn't whether they make mistakes, because everyone does. The measure is what they do after, whether they learn and grow or stay the same." She wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture so childlike it made several of the watching bikers' hearts clench with guilt. "Mr. Sullivan didn't know who I was," Emma continued, her words thoughtful and measured. "He was trying to protect something he loves, even if he did it the wrong way. Grandpa Jack would say that deserves a chance to understand, not just punishment." The room fell silent again, this profound statement from a 7-year-old child rendering hardened bikers speechless. Bear's eyebrows rose slightly, and Frank made a sound that might have been a sob or a laugh or both. Derek stared at Emma as if seeing her for the first time, truly seeing her. And the shame on his face deepened into something that looked like genuine remorse. Emma turned slightly toward Frank, drawing courage from his kind face. "Grandpa Jack used to tell me stories all the time," she said, her voice growing stronger as she spoke about her grandfather. "He told me about the road and the brotherhood and what it meant to be part of a family that you chose, not just the one you were born into. He said respect isn't about being the biggest or the strongest or the one who's been around the longest. He said respect is about seeing people for who they really are, about listening before you judge, about understanding that everyone carries something important inside them, even if you can't see it at first." She pulled the journal closer to her chest, hugging it as if it contained her grandfather himself. Bear gestured to the tables and chairs scattered around the clubhouse. "Everyone sit down," he said, his tone making it clear this was not a request. "We're having a club meeting right now, and everyone present needs to hear this." Bikers moved quickly, dragging chairs into a loose circle, their earlier festive mood completely evaporated. Derek sat heavily in a chair near the back, his elbows on his knees and his head bowed. Emma was guided to a seat of honor near Frank, who kept one protective hand on the back of her chair. Bear stood in the center of the circle, his arms crossed, and began to speak about the founding of the Iron Kings. He talked about how 7 people had come together 40 years ago with a vision of creating something different, a brotherhood built not on intimidation or exclusivity, but on genuine connection and shared values. He spoke about how, over time, clubs could lose their way, how the rituals meant to honor tradition could become walls that kept people out, instead of bridges that brought them in. "There's a difference between respecting tradition and becoming gatekeepers," Bear said, his voice heavy with conviction. "Respecting tradition means understanding why something matters and honoring its true purpose. Becoming gatekeepers means using tradition as a weapon to make ourselves feel superior, to keep others out, to create hierarchies based on arbitrary rules instead of character. Frank raised his hand, his weathered face serious. Jackson never turned anyone away who came to him with genuine respect and honest intention, he said. I remember a kid. Couldn't have been more than 19. Showed up wanting to learn about bikes. Didn't have money for his own. Didn't have fancy gear. Jackson spent 6 months teaching that kid everything he knew, helped him fix up an old junker, never asked for a dime. That kid is sitting in this room right now, 30 years later, wearing his colors with pride. The man Frank pointed to nodded, his eyes glistening. Other older members began sharing their own stories. Maria spoke about how Jackson had welcomed her when other clubs told her women didn't belong on serious rides. Another founding member, Carlos, talked about Jackson spending Christmas with his family when Carlos was going through a divorce and had nowhere else to go. When the meeting finally paused, Derek stood slowly from his chair. Every eye in the room watched as he walked across the wooden floor toward where Emma sat beside Frank. His swagger was completely gone now, replaced by something hesitant and uncertain, the walk of a man who had been stripped of his illusions about himself and didn't like what he had discovered underneath. He stopped a respectful distance away and lowered himself to one knee so that he could look Emma in the eye instead of towering over her. "Emma?" he said, and his voice was rough with emotion. Nothing like the booming, confident tone he had used earlier. "I need to apologize to you, and I need to do it right." He took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. "I judged you the moment I saw you. I decided you didn't belong here based on nothing but your size and your age. I didn't listen when you tried to explain. I talked over you, mocked you, encouraged others to mock you. I used my position and my size to make you feel small and unwelcome in a place where you had every right to be." Derek's hands were shaking slightly, clasped together in front of him. "I've become exactly what this club was supposed to stand against. I became arrogant. I started thinking that my 20 years here made me better than other people, that I had the right to decide who was worthy. I turned respect into gatekeeping, and I hurt you in the process. I'm deeply, truly sorry." Emma watched him with those clear blue eyes, and Derek couldn't tell what she was thinking. He pressed on, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Your grandfather sounds like he was an incredible man. A real hero, not just because of what he did in that accident, but because of how he lived every day. I never got to meet him, and that's my loss, but if you'd be willing, I'd like to learn about him from you. I'd like to understand what he believed in, what he taught you, what made him the kind of person who deserved that patch." For a long moment, Emma didn't respond. Then, slowly, she nodded and reached for the envelope of photographs still sitting on Frank's lap. 6 months later, the Iron Kings gathered again for their spring ride kickoff. And the clubhouse felt different in ways both subtle and profound. Derek Sullivan stood near the doorway, but his posture had changed entirely from that day in October. He no longer carried himself with the aggressive confidence of a man who believed his size and position made him right. Instead, he stood with a quieter assurance, the kind that came from genuine growth and hard-won understanding. He had completed his 100 hours of community service at the youth center. But he hadn't stopped there. Working with at-risk teenagers, kids who society had written off as troublemakers or lost causes, had opened Derek's eyes to how damaging snap judgments could be. He had seen himself in the way those kids built walls to protect themselves, the way they assumed everyone would reject them before giving anyone a chance to see who they really were. The experience had changed him fundamentally, breaking down the arrogance that had once defined him. Derek had taken his transformation further, working with Bear and Frank to establish the Jackson Morrison Memorial Mentorship Program. The initiative connected experienced club members with young people in the community who needed guidance, teaching them about motorcycle maintenance, road safety, and the values of loyalty and courage that the Iron Kings were supposed to represent. Emma visited the clubhouse regularly now, usually on Sunday afternoons when her grandmother could bring her. She had become something of a beloved fixture. The little girl in the Phoenix patch, who knew more stories about the club's history than most of the members. She would sit with Frank and the other founding members, pulling out her grandfather's journal and sharing passages about different rides, different moments, different lessons Jackson had wanted to preserve. The club had reformed their entire approach to initiation and membership, inspired by Emma's grace and the mirror she had held up to their failures. New policies emphasized character assessment over arbitrary requirements, created pathways for community involvement before full membership, and established clear guidelines about respect and inclusion. Derek had become one of the most passionate advocates for these changes. The annual memorial ride for fallen members took place on a brilliant spring morning, and Emma Morrison sat proudly in the sidecar attached to Frank Cooper's motorcycle, her blonde braids streaming behind her in the wind, the phoenix patch on her back visible to everyone in the formation. 73 motorcycles rode in tight formation through the winding roads outside the city, their engines creating a symphony of power and remembrance. At the front of the pack rode Bear, and directly behind him rode Derek Sullivan, who now wore a small pin on his vest that read, "Jackson's Legacy," to remind himself daily of the lesson he had learned. The Iron Kings had grown stronger through the painful lesson taught by a 7-year-old child, and their brotherhood deepened by the understanding that true strength had nothing to do with size or volume or the ability to intimidate. Emma had taught grown men and women that dignity in the face of humiliation was more powerful than any show of force, that grace toward those who wrong you required more courage than any revenge. Derek had become a mentor himself, working 3 afternoons a week with teenagers who reminded him of the person he used to be, arrogant and quick to judge. Certain that his way was the only way, he would tell them Emma's story, would talk about the day he let his pride blind him to what really mattered, would share how a child's forgiveness had given him the chance to become someone better. The phoenix patch that Emma wore served as a constant reminder to everyone in the club that from the ashes of mistakes and failures, renewal could rise if people had the courage to change. Jackson Morrison's legacy lived on not just in the stories told about him, but in the transformation his granddaughter had sparked. In the lives Derek now touched with humility instead of arrogance, in the new members welcomed with open hearts instead of suspicious gatekeeping. The real marks of strength, the Iron Kings had learned, were dignity, grace, and the courage to admit when you were wrong and grow from it. True respect was never earned through intimidation or exclusion, but through character. Through how you treated people when they seemed powerless, through whether you took the time to truly see someone before deciding who they were. What you wore on your back mattered far less than who you were inside. And the smallest person could carry the biggest lesson if only others would stop talking long enough to listen.